Okay, well, welcome to another podcast. And I'm delighted to have a guest with me on this one, who I think you'll enjoy as well. Now, so this is Jeroen Van Nieuwenhove. Hoven?
Yeah,
Close, but no cigar.
close. It's a difficult name.
Um, And Jeroen, if you haven't seen his work, now we'll put a link to his website and his Instagram account in the description. Jeroen is based in Iceland, originally from Belgium, now based in Iceland, and primarily wildlife, nature, that style of photography.
Yeah, I like to call myself a hybrid photographer, so I focus a lot on landscapes and wildlife. I kind of combine or try to combine both of them.
Great. Well, from what I've seen, you do an amazing job and I do recommend everyone have a look at the website because there's some amazing stuff on there. So we were having a little chat before we started about how we're going to run this, and I think what I'm going to do is hand over to you to maybe talk a little bit about. Tell us a bit more about the kind of photography you do. The people who listen to the podcast, a lot are interested in the wildlife photography aspects and what goes on and how you approach it and all of that. So I should have given you a heads up on that earlier, but there you go. So I'll hand over to you to share a little bit of what you do and perhaps how people can get involved.
Yeah, so I started out long time ago. I started out my journey not in landscape or wildlife. I started in concert and event photography, and then I kind of felt like I needed an escape from that, so I started to delve more into landscapes. And then very quickly, I've always had sort of a fascination with any kind of animal, really, and very quickly I started to look into how I could do more wildlife. And I think the initial phase in that was when I started to discover Arctic foxes here in Iceland. And I, for some reason, and I still am super fascinated by them and how to photograph them and see them in the wild. It's something that, I find them such interesting animals, both in terms of how they behave, but also how they manage to survive in such extreme environments. And that's really where it got started for me. And here in Iceland, we don't have an awful lot of interesting wildlife, I have to say. But we have a lot of birds, so I'm also fairly big into bird photography. And my absolute favorite subject there are the Atlantic puffin, which I absolutely love photographing. They're an absolute joy to see and to capture.
Yeah, I'm curious about the foxes actually. So, how easy is it to find them, or is this one of these situations where you need to sort of stake out an area for a while and maybe use a hide or something like that to see them?
Yeah, well, it really depends where you go, because in the vast majority of Iceland, Arctic foxes are very, very shy. They fear people. The reason they fear people is because for the longest time and still today, foxes are seen as sort of vermin. So people tend to shoot them. This idea of foxes being vermin is a little bit changing now over the years. And there's one particular area, there's a protected nature reserve in the northwest of Iceland where foxes are basically free. There's no one hunting them. Regulations in regards to approaching them are very strict, even though they're awfully curious about people as well.
Yeah.
And they love human structures. This is an area where now probably for the 9th or the 10th generation, foxes have lived without being in fear of being hunted.
Okay.
So in Iceland, that's probably the best location to go to. I mean, I don't know how they count this, but I've heard numbers as much as 80% of the entire Arctic fox population in Iceland is supposedly living there. But outside of that area, you can see foxes pretty much anywhere in the country. But most of the time, they will see you and you won't see them because they are very afraid of people. But there are some other areas where I've been where tend to not be so shy. And yeah, then you can approach them fairly easily. There's absolutely no need to sit in a hide. I think the most important thing is that you don't wear super bright colors, that you don't make any sudden movements.
Yeah.
But generally, they're not so bothered by people if you meet them in an area where they are not afraid of people.
Right. And that's great. And what sort of camera gear are you using to photograph them? Has that changed over time?
Yeah, so I'm now using primarily, and I have for several years now, I'm primarily using the 100 to 500 Canon RF
Yeah.
lens. I absolutely love that lens because
Yeah.
it's so versatile. It's well built. It's built like a tank. I think I've owned mine now probably 5 years now, maybe a little bit longer, and
Okay.
it still feels like it's brand new. It makes super sharp images, and of course, it's not as good in low light. But I find that photographing at high ISO these days doesn't really matter all that much anymore. You can clean up images even at really high ISO
Yeah.
very easily, and
Yeah.
especially foxes. When I photograph them, it's usually bright enough for it to not matter.
Yeah.
Then I've also used the 200 to 800, which I tested recently, and I specifically tested those with while photographing Arctic foxes.
Yeah.
And I use all of that in combination with EOS R5 Mark II now.
Okay.
But over the years, I've had a variety of cameras. I've had the R5, the R6, had the original R, which was probably one of the most frustrating cameras I've ever owned
Yeah, I think
in
they've
my
gone
life.
through a learning curve.
Yeah, they've definitely improved a lot over the years. But I'm very happy with my R5 Mark II today,
Yeah.
which is an excellent camera for wildlife.
Brilliant. And do you use that with the puffins as well? Is that a sort of go-to lens for you?
Yes. Yeah, I use the 100 to 500. I'm like looking into maybe buying something that has a wider aperture, just to give me a little bit more options when it does get darker.
Yeah.
But for the puffins, it doesn't really matter because at the time you photograph them, we pretty much have 24 hours of daylight. So the times that you would need a really wide aperture is really in terms of light, probably in dusk twilight kind of situations.
Yeah.
But definitely, like I don't feel like I've missed it so far, but I've used one this summer to test it. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, but I didn't feel like it. I love my 100 to 500 so much for this purpose that I didn't feel like I missed out on a lot there.
Yeah. Yeah. So presumably, are you tending to photograph more in the summer because you've got longer days, and so you've got light for much more of the day?
Yeah, for wildlife, it's definitely mostly in the summer, also because most of the birds are here in the summer. In the winter, we have some birds that stick around, but it's not an awful lot. And the foxes, that becomes very difficult in the winter because logistically, to get to that area where they're protected, for example, it's quite a challenge because this area is protected. You can't get there easily. It's not like you can drive there with a car. You need to get someone with a boat. In the winter, you can't really camp, so you need to book a stay in one of the very few houses that are left there after people used to live there. So there are a lot of abandoned houses that you can hire for your stay, and it's not so easy to stay there and to be there. So in the winter, options are very limited for wildlife photography here.
Yeah. So is that when you would tend to look at? We were talking about Antarctica, and you were heading down there. So I think we should talk about where you operate. But Antarctica, do you tend to go down there in the northern winter? So when it's summer down there? Yes.
So when it's summer, because that's the only, I'm sure there are ways to go there in the winter, but I think it's probably very, very hard. Logistically, but also to be outside, it must be very hard. So
Yeah.
Yeah, so we go there now. My next trip there will be in February. Very much looking forward to being there again.
Yeah. And what's the purpose of that? Is that more wildlife, or is that for your
It's
own work, or is that for a project or to support something else?
it's a joint workshop that I'm running with a few other photographers, both wildlife and landscape photographers. And this is originally hosted by Nigel Danson, very famous landscape photographer, but some famous wildlife photographers on that trip will be Rachel Bixby, for example, Danny Connor, who's very famous with her squirrel images in
Yeah.
Sweden. And it's a trip where the landscapes are amazing, but for me the wildlife in the landscapes is where it's really at.
Yeah.
There's not really any place in the world I've been that's quite like this, because I find like the first time, I'll never forget the first time I went to a penguin rookery. We got off the Zodiac and you start walking around, and what amazed me immediately was it almost felt like you're in some kind of BBC Earth documentary.
Yeah.
Everything is kind of happening around you, and none of the penguins seem to care that you're there.
Yeah.
They are not curious. They are not scared. They are just doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget this one moment where I'm walking in the snow, and then I'm taking a photo of a penguin, and on my right there are two penguins that came waddling towards me. And I thought, okay, oh, these are curious. They want to come and look at what I'm doing. But that wasn't really true, because about 3 meters from me, they stopped. And I walked backwards to give them some space. And then they just kind of walked or continued on their path, like I was some kind of obstacle that was there. They didn't really expect it, and I needed to move out of the way. And that's
Yeah.
something that I find really curious. It's almost like the wildlife is so indifferent about your presence there that it feels like you're in some kind of 3D documentary.
It's like the exact opposite of the Arctic foxes
Yeah, exactly.
outside of the
Completely the opposite. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
the foxes, they're so curious about you. Like one of the things that I find quite interesting is that the regulations here say that you need to give the foxes space, so you can't just go and walk up to them and sit right next to them, which makes total sense. But what's really strange is that the foxes, obviously, they don't know about human imposed rules,
Yeah.
but also they come and walk towards you, and in some instances, they even make their burrows under human structures that are there. So, for example, in this nature reserve, there is a place where they put up like a big shelter tent, and the foxes, they made a burrow underneath the platform they made to put the tent on, and that is right in the middle of a campsite. So, as a human,
Oh, well,
you would
yeah.
almost have to say, "I'm not going to use the campsite anymore if I need to give them space." But they choose to go to places where humans are, and they choose to be around people. And I
Yeah.
find that quite interesting, that they're very curious about people. They're not afraid at all. And sometimes they will walk up to you so close that you can't even take a photo.
Yeah.
I have one instance where I was kind of like, I knew there was some fox activity in the area, and I sat a little bit. This was up on a hill where there was an old platform where there used to be a house. And I went down to the beach to kind of give some space and just see what would happen. And after about an hour, this adult fox comes running with a bird in her mouth. I presume it was probably a female. And I run up the path to get a closer look where she's going. And then suddenly there's about 15 Arctic fox cubs that come crawling out of the ground
Oh,
all over
wow.
the place. So
Wow.
their den was much bigger than I thought it was.
Yeah.
They come crawling out of it, and one of them ran up to me, probably thinking that I was maybe the mom, and he was sitting literally maybe like half a meter in front of me,
Wow.
and I couldn't even take a photo. You know, I was sitting there
Yeah.
with my 100 to 500. I had a 2x extender on.
Oh,
I
crikey.
was
Yeah.
ready to take some distance images from this, and you know, this was impossible, but it was an
Yeah.
absolutely memorable moment. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I do want to talk about, and we spoke about it briefly, and to everybody listening, have a look at the blog, because I'm like humpback whales, one of my things, and you put a blog out yesterday. We're recording this on the 11th of November, about humpback whales off the west coast of Greenland, and the photographs absolutely stunning. And obviously, some of them are taken with a drone. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about what you're doing with drones, just your experiences in that environment with those animals.
Yeah, I've been over the last few years, I've been using drones more and more, primarily for landscapes, but for marine wildlife, I find that they're very useful tools as well, because with whales, you're always photographing them from sea level, and obviously the most amazing thing is happening underwater.
Yeah.
So I decided to start using drones to try and kind of capture that a little bit more. In the west of Greenland, where I go, in a place called Ilulissat, it's we're the biggest, it's probably the largest ice fjord in the world, in the sense that there's a lot of ice calving from the Greenlandic ice sheet.
Yeah.
And there are icebergs there the size of small towns. It's kind of ridiculous what is floating around there. But it's a very popular feeding ground for humpback whales. So this year, when I went back in September with a group on a photo workshop, we were very lucky that there was a fairly large pod sticking around in the area feeding. And at one point, this was on the second day, I think, we went to the boat. So we've chartered a boat for 4 hours to be on the water. And our main focus was going to be whales, because we had already been seeing whales on the moment that we arrived. In the morning that we were supposed to go on the boat trip, they were just sort of swimming in front of the hotel, which is kind of surreal. You open up the balcony door and you hear them breathing. It's absolutely amazing. But then we went on the water, and within 5 minutes we are next to this pod of humpback whales, and we kind of start following them around. And then at one point we realize they start bubble net feeding. So we see them dive, and then you see all like a big flock of birds kind of going around. And at one point, and this is really amazing, is that you see all the birds, obviously they see something that we can't see, and suddenly they all kind of swoop to one area, and then you see the humpbacks kind of lunging out of the water, which is incredible.
Yeah.
And the only thing I could think about at that point was, how good would this look with a drone? Because anyone who knows about bubble net feeding, they do this little spiral, really, really beautiful. And we were so close to the airstrip of the airport that technically the drone could not take off. Yeah. So even if my intention was to fly only 10, 15 meters above the water, I just couldn't, because we were so close to the airport. Yeah. So for about 3 hours, we kind of just followed them around. We were photographing them as they went in between the icebergs. And every time they would go north, almost at the edge of the restriction zone around the airport, and they would go back again, and then up again and back again. They're following the food. Very frustrating. Yeah. Until in the last hour we had on a boat charter, the whales decide to swim away. We were following them. I had a drone remote on to see when we were out of the restriction zone. And then finally managed to put the drone up, and I got these really incredible images of the 5 whales kind of swimming next to each other. Fortunately, we're not feeding anymore, but the images I got from that were really amazing. Yeah. At one point, I took a photo where you see the 5 whales are kind of in a line. They're aligned with a small iceberg that's floating, which looked really, really good. And I really like using a drone like that, like you can see something that you can't actually see from the ground. And these animals are so beautiful to see. And Greenland's a really great place for that. Well, a little bit later in the trip, we, the same whales were just kind of swimming around the area where the hotel was. And one morning, I opened up my balcony door, and I could hear the whales breathing, but I couldn't see them because the night before, a lot of slush ice had been pushed out of the ice fjord.
Okay.
So you could hear them breathing, but there were so many small icebergs that you couldn't see their backs emerge out of the water behind them. And I spent some time looking at them, and then at one point I saw one, and then I realized it was swimming outside of this drone restriction area. So we are in a hotel based just at the edge of what is like, you have to imagine it's like a big circle around the airstrip. And we were at the bottom of that circle on the southern end, and they were swimming outside of it. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment where I'm going to be able to take that photo that I've been dreaming about a long time, which is having this humpback swimming in between the ice. And we are, like, I see them go, and I text the group who was just about to get ready for breakfast. I sent them a text and I said, I've seen these whales. I'm going to this location. I'm running out now because I want to see where they are. I want to keep tracking them, because if I lose them, we all lose them.
Yeah.
So I run. Some of the people in the group immediately got up from breakfast, took their stuff, ran out of the hotel, went to this place. I was already there, and I managed to follow the whale out of town. So I had to run for like 2 kilometers to get there. And then we're sitting at this viewpoint, and then I find the whale. And turns out there were 2 whales, not just one. I just couldn't see the second one.
Yeah.
And they were kind of very slowly going in between the ice, and sometimes they would kind of stick their heads out next to an iceberg. And everybody in the group got amazing shots of that. It was absolutely amazing. Like, you can photograph whales anywhere on the planet, really, but there are not very many places where you can photograph them with something extra to it. Like, you don't have the icebergs around it, and I feel like that's something really special to me, something I've been dreaming about for a while. And
that's what struck me about those photographs, just seeing them with the ice, because I'm seeing them a lot off the coast of Sydney, but we don't have too many icebergs. So
no,
completely
exactly.
different, environment for the whales to be in. I think that's an important part of the story as well, showing the different environment the animals live in.
It's pretty incredible, like, these icebergs, they are enormous. Like, the fraction that you can see above the water in this area of the world is about 20%, and 80% is underwater. And what's really interesting is that the whales are almost playing hide and seek with us. Like, the first evening on that trip, we are standing on the edge of the ice fjord, and we've been there for I think we were there for 2 hours already or something, photographing the icebergs. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, 3 humpback whales appear meters off where we are standing, and nobody had seen them.
Yeah.
So we are flying drones over the icebergs and everything, and the water is very clear there. Nobody had seen these whales. They just kind of appeared out of nowhere. And that's what makes this really tricky in Greenland, is that there are a lot of whales around, but you might not be able to see them just because of the icebergs.
Yeah.
So
I'm assuming this is a feeding ground. So they will go to the area, and then they'll be there for a few months before the season.
So they usually arrive around the middle of June, sometimes earlier, and then they will leave middle of September. But it really depends on where the food is going. If the ocean temperature starts dropping, the food moves away, and then they follow the food, really.
So one thing that struck me, or one question that occurred to me while you were speaking, you've had some amazing encounters. Are there any that really stand out for you, whether it's an encounter with an animal or a photograph that you were able to take, something that we haven't already discussed? Is there anything that stands out?
Yeah, definitely. I think last year we had, I was in Eastern Greenland on a sailboat expedition. This was the first time I ran this photo workshop. And so the way this trip goes is you fly on a charter flight, you go to a very remote area in East Greenland, and then you get on a sailboat. And from there, you're basically disconnected from the world for 7 days. Mm-hmm. And what happened then was within, I think we were, maybe 14 hours into the trip or something. We sailed through the night to a glacier front that's really beautiful. And after we went to that glacier front, I think about an hour after we had breakfast, the captain comes to me and he says, we may have a polar bear further up. We think we've seen something, but it's probably a good idea to get the group ready so they have their cameras ready, but we don't know, we don't know what's going to happen. So you have to imagine this location in Greenland it's all rock. So a polar bear, you'd think it would stand out, but it doesn't really, because it sort of blends into the color of the rocks there.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you approach them, they see you coming from a long way. They might even smell you from a long way. Sometimes they will just jump in the water and they start swimming. So he's very careful about it. The boat kind of drifts closer and closer to it, and we start seeing it. And in the beginning, we have the camera. I'm using the R5 with my 500, and then I have a 2x extender on it. And then if I cropped in on the image that I took, then you could see that the polar bear just lying on the rock. We're getting closer and closer, and I keep taking photos as closer that we. Every time we got closer, I take new photos in hopes to get something really good eventually. And suddenly, when we were almost close, the polar bear gets up and he jumps into the water. And we thought at that moment, we must have scared him or something. And he starts swimming. And what was really interesting is that I only found out after the trip, when I got home and I started looking at all the images, that we were no part in whatever happened there, because my R5 took 15 shots every second.
Yeah.
And if you look at those 15 shots of the sequence of when he's jumping into the water, there are about 4 photos where you see the head of a seal sticking out of the water in front of him.
Yeah.
So he was very clearly, he was hunting. He was maybe wasn't even paying attention to us. He got up and jumped for the seal. He didn't manage to get it because we didn't see the seal again after that. And most of us didn't even, other than these photos, nobody even knew there was a seal there. But the polar bear swimming, and I'm thinking already, we're not going to see him again, because you see his little head on the water. It's a little bit wavy. It's impossible to take photos. And he swims past an iceberg, and the whole group is in front of the boat. And I jokingly say, what's going to happen now? He's going to stop. He's going to climb out of the water. He's going to pose for us on this iceberg, to keep everyone like a little bit motivated. Yeah. And he swims past the iceberg and then stops. And I'm trying to compute what's going to happen there. And I'm like, no way, this is going to happen. And the polar bear climbs onto the ice out of the water. And it's amazing how they do this. Like, I managed to take some photos of, how he walks on the ice. And it's incredible how he's completely wet and then crawl out of the ice on top of something super slippery. And he starts shaking off all the water on his fur and then starts further climbing on the ice. At that point, I think my brain is already melting because of the excitement.
Yeah.
And he crawls up onto the edge, and that's when I noticed there's you have the iceberg, and there's a hole in the iceberg that you can look through. And I'm just like, no way, he's gonna walk through this hole or something. And he walks behind the hole, and then sticks his head through and looks at us, and everybody's taking photos to their heart content. This was just incredible. Have this polar bear on this amazing blue iceberg, and then he sticks his head through a hole. What more do you want? And he walks further on, and then sits on top of a place. And now I realize what he was doing. He was trying to find the seal again from a higher vantage point. We didn't realize at all, and we kind of drifted closer. The captain had switched off the engine, so we just kind of drifted. And the polar bear sitting there, we spent quite a bit of time with him, photographing him from every possible angle. Until at one point he decides to walk down, and that's when I got these really amazing photos of the of the polar bear kind of climbing down on the ice, and then he went swimming again to see if he could find the seal, apparently. And that was just incredible. And you have to imagine this is less than 24 hours into a trip of 7 days.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
you're just like,
standard.
okay, if you go back and take us back to the airport right now, everybody will be happy.
Yeah.
This was absolutely unbelievable, and by far, I think one of the most exciting encounters I've had with any kind of wildlife, I think.
Yeah. Wow. You run workshops, so if for people who are really interested in what you do and where you do it as well, what's available for people? How can they come and join you? And do you teach them technique as well as taking them to places?
Yeah, so one of my favorite ones is probably the puffin focused one, which I do on a remote island off the north coast of Iceland. We stay there in a small guest house. It's actually the house of one of the locals. There's about 30 people living there, which is very nice because it gives you. I like, for me, workshops, they should be an experience as well as focused on photography. And it's really interesting, to spend time with someone who lives in such a small island community. But then basically the structure of that workshop is that we go out every day. We go hiking around the island, find, based on the weather, the most interesting spot to photograph the puffins. And for me, this is a really important workshop because if you're into wildlife, or you're thinking about getting into wildlife, or you want to really try and perfect your skills, then this is the best place to go, because what we do is basically rinse and repeat. So you go and photograph the birds. The morning after, we sit down and we talk about 3 images that you really liked and 3 images that you thought this doesn't work and want to know why it doesn't work. And then we kind of, in group, we kind of break it down and talk about what you should be doing different, how you should be handling it, and then we go and try it again. And that's we do that about 6 days. We're on the island focusing on that, and I feel really important that everybody has their own approach. There are some people who go and do workshops on this island, and they kind of just you just kind of go out and do your own thing. I find it's really important to you can't. For example, you can't be 5 people photographing the same bird, but we try to stay within a reasonable amount of space along the cliffside, so you can come and ask me questions, so I can help you in the field. And I think it's a really, really exciting workshop for me as well, because I love to see how people go from maybe not knowing anything about wildlife photography to becoming really good at it. Because you can do repetition, you can do it constantly, and it's a great place to see how people improve. Then I do also all the Greenland workshops. They're not, that's sort of a blend between landscape and wildlife, I would say. Wildlife primarily being the whales. On the eastern side, on the sailboat trip, then of course we have a chance for polar bears, but there's absolutely never any guarantee that you're going to see a polar bear. But these are kind of, for me, it's very important to try and teach you in the field how to do this. And usually we have enough time to handle that. And then I also have a Arctic fox workshop where we do the same thing, the same approach as the puffin workshop, where we go out every day to see if we can find the foxes, to photograph them, and then try to evaluate the images you took and see how we can improve them. And what I find is that most of the time, within the first 2 days, people get a good sense of how to compose and how to shoot. And the vast majority of the problems are editing problems. Like most of the time, people take a beautiful photo, but then kind of wreck it with editing. So we spend quite a lot of time on, what's a good way to edit images like that, what makes it a compelling image. And try to kind of, everybody has their own style, but I try to steer people within their style to getting really great results.
I like what you said about seeing the improvement in people. One thing I love from when I teach is just seeing the change in someone when they realize that they can do something that they wanted to do for a long time but thought was beyond them. Then all of a sudden, the penny drops. They realize that they can shoot that kind of image, and they can do it again and again. And that's warning.
And there's no better way to teach than being out in the field, I think, because there's so many YouTube videos where you can learn all about settings and photograph, like how to photograph birds, for example, and how to compose them. But to apply that to your own environment is very, very difficult. To go from that video to doing it out in the field. When you're out in the field, then you have someone standing next to you that can tell you should try and change this or try to position the bird more in that way. That's a invaluable thing. I think it's the most important thing you could be doing.
Absolutely, and I think it's one thing watching a video. Anybody can do that, but you've then got to go and apply it. And then when it doesn't give you the result that you were expecting, you need really someone to guide you as to what do you need to do next? What do you need to think about to change it?
Exactly. So, and I just wanted to add, like, for example, with the puffin workshop that, some people sometimes give me the response like, my God, what are we going to do there for 6 days? Isn't it easy to take a photo of a puffin? And then if I show them all the images, because that's how I start the workshop, I give a little presentation and I show all the ways you could be documenting them, then people are like, oh, okay, there's a lot more to it than just taking a photo of a bird. You want to have them in certain interactions with each other. Maybe you want to have them with fish. Sometimes they're there with shrimp. Maybe you want to shoot them in fog, in rain. If it's really windy, they start behaving really differently. And for example, birds in flight, that's something very difficult to learn.
Absolutely.
And on this island, I found a really good way to teach anyone to find a good way to do that. And I find, in 6 days, I can guarantee you will not get bored of it at all. No. Even though it might sound like it's something really simple, to do it really well, you need to spend time on it. That's just the reality.
What would be your advice to anybody who is either thinking about getting into wildlife photography, for their own pleasure, or maybe someone who is struggling a little bit with it? They're just not getting the results that they would hope to get. What would you suggest to someone that they start to think about if they're getting into wildlife photography?
Well, I think the thing that I often see is people get lost in gear. Because something I see a lot on YouTube, for example, is that photographers who do this professionally probably have really high-end lenses. And the problem is almost never the equipment. Yeah. Sure, there is, some camera bodies have much better autofocus than others, especially now with all the eye tracking and everything. But the problem is usually not the camera, it's how you use the camera. Yeah. And one thing that I find to make it really simple is I use a lot of custom modes on my camera. So I program the C1, C2, C3 buttons in a certain way that they are ready for wildlife. So, for example, my main wildlife one I've set to 1/2000 a second, shutter speed, widest aperture possible, eye tracking, servo autofocus, these kind of things, auto ISO. And what that does is it takes away from you trying to, you losing yourself in the technical side of it, and you focusing on learning the composition. Yeah. And I think that's the most important thing to learn is the composition. You can set your camera. There's no shame in setting your camera in doing almost everything automatic. No. Like I set my camera to basically the only variable thing when I do wildlife is the shutter speed, and everything else I just let the camera figure out so I can focus on doing what's important, and that's capturing the right moment. Yeah. And I think that's the most important thing is get a good zoom lens, get a body that has good eye autofocus tracking, set up a custom mode, and then focus on being out and shooting. Yeah. And the single biggest mistake I see people make is give up too early. You need to spend time in it. You need to spend time on it, and the more time you spend on it, the better you'll get.
Yeah, and there is where we learn is where things don't go as expected, and I think that's something to also embrace. Don't get put off by that. Just learn from things not coming out the way you thought, because
exactly.
we've all had lots of that.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's why on my workshops I want to see your worst images, because that's where we can then talk about why are they the worst images. Yeah. Or if you have an image where you say like, I like this photo, but it doesn't quite work well. That's something that I hear a lot, and then we can talk about why that is. Because for most people, it seems to be very difficult to put in words why something doesn't work.
Exactly.
And that's the thing that I think is the most important to learn, is understand why things don't work.
Yeah, because as you get more specific about what is wrong with the image, you can then begin to identify, well, this is what you have to do differently. You've got specific things you can change, and then you can become consistent producing high quality images if all goes well. Before we finish, is there anything else you'd like to say or share before we wind this up?
Well, I think one of the things I also sometimes hear is that people, I go to places like Greenland, I spend a lot of time in Iceland, and they are incredible places, but don't feel like a good wildlife photo is because someone is in an amazing place or is showing an incredible animal. A good wildlife photo, for me at least, has more to do with how well it was composed, how unique the image is, or like how unique the moment is that you capture. And you could start in your backyard and try it. You don't have to go to any.
Absolutely.
You don't have to go photograph polar bears on the North Pole. To get compelling images. You can start anywhere. There's animals everywhere. Yeah. You just have to look for them.
Absolutely. If you do that practice at home, then when you do get to see a polar bear, you know exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, you don't want to be...
It's amazing.
Yeah, you don't want to be freaking out the moment you see a polar bear and then not know what to do, because the moment might be very fleeting. You might only see it for 1 minute. Who knows?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Jeroen, thank you so much for spending time with me, and I hope everyone's found this as interesting as I have. For everyone listening, please take a look at the website, Instagram. Be inspired. We all get inspired by each other, and it's one of the nice things about photography. And maybe explore doing a workshop. So thanks again, Jeroen, and have a great day. So it's evening here in Sydney, but you're just getting started.
Yeah, I'm just getting started. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Absolute pleasure. Bye now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.